The wind howled across the barren hills of New Mexico territory, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another lonely night. Jake Morrison pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face and guided his horse toward the small cabin that had been his only companion for the past 7 years. 7 years since he'd walked away from everything he'd ever known. 7 years since he'd broken the heart of the only woman he'd ever loved. 7 years of trying to forget eyes as dark as midnight and a smile that had once made him believe in tomorrow. The cabin sat nestled in a valley between 2 rolling hills, protected from the worst of the desert winds, but isolated enough that Jake could go weeks without seeing another soul. That's exactly how he wanted it. People brought complications, and complications brought pain. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Jake dismounted and led his horse to the small corral beside the cabin. The animal whinnied softly, sensing his master's familiar melancholy as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Another day ending, another night of memories he couldn't escape. He was reaching for the saddle when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Someone was knocking on his door. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip. In 7 years, not a single soul had found their way to his doorstep. This valley was marked on no map, known to no settler or drifter. His heart hammered. As he approached the cabin, boots crunching softly on the rocky ground, the knocking came again, weaker this time. Not the demanding rap of a lawman or the aggressive pounding of trouble. This was different, desperate. Pleading, Jake drew his weapon and slowly opened the door. What he saw nearly brought him to his knees. A young Apache woman stood swaying on his doorstep, her long black hair matted with blood, her buckskin dress torn and stained. She looked up at him with eyes he recognized instantly, though they were now clouded with pain and exhaustion. "Ayanna," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. She smiled weakly, that same smile that had haunted his dreams for 7 long years. "Hello, Jake," she said in the soft, musical voice he remembered so well, and she collapsed into his arms. Chapter 2. Ghosts of the Past. Jake carried Ayanna's unconscious form into the cabin, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some fever dream brought on by too much whiskey and too many lonely nights. But the weight of her in his arms, the familiar scent of wildflowers in her hair despite the blood and dust, told him otherwise. She was real. She was here. And she was hurt. He laid her gently on his narrow bed. The same bed where he'd spent countless nights staring at the ceiling and wondering what had become of her. His hands shook as he lit the oil lamp, bathing the cabin in warm golden light. The glow revealed the extent of her injuries. A deep gash ran along her left temple, and her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing scratches and bruises. But it was her hands that made Jake's stomach clench. They were bound with rope, the skin raw and bleeding where she'd struggled against her bonds. "What happened to you?" he murmured, reaching for the knife at his belt to cut the ropes. As the bonds fell away, Ayanna stirred, her eyelids fluttering. "Jake," her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," he said, surprised by how easily the words came. For 7 years he practiced being alone, being hard, being empty. But with her lying there, all of that crumbled away. "You're safe now." She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent pain through her battered body. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, tears beginning to well in her dark eyes. "They killed my husband. They killed everyone." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Husband? Of course she'd married. Of course she'd moved on. He'd walked away from her. After all, he'd made that choice. "Who?" he managed to ask, reaching for a cloth to clean the blood from her temple. "Who did this?" "Soldiers," she said, flinching as he dabbed at her wound. "They came to our village 3 days ago, said we were harboring Apache raiders, but it wasn't true. My husband, running wolf, he tried to reason with them, tried to show them we were peaceful. They shot him down like a dog." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd heard stories of such raids, soldiers who couldn't tell the difference between peaceful Apache families and the war parties that still roamed the territory. Or worse, soldiers who simply didn't care. "How did you get away?" he asked his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. "I hid in the root cellar when the shooting started," she said, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "When it was over, I could hear them laughing, dividing up what they could steal. They found me as they were leaving. Her captain said I'd fetch a good price in Santa Fe." The cloth in Jake's hand stilled. "Santa Fe?" She nodded, her eyes meeting. "His?" "I heard them talking. There's a man there who pays well for Apache women. They were taking me to him when I escaped. I've been running for 2 days." Jake felt something dark and dangerous stir in his chest. He'd spent 7 years trying to bury the man he'd once been, the man who'd worn a badge and believed in justice. But hearing what had been done to Ayanna, to her people, made that old fire burn bright again. "You need rest," he said, forcing himself to focus on her immediate needs. "And food. When did you last eat?" "I don't remember," she admitted. "Before they came, I think." Jake rose and moved to his small stove, grateful for something to do with his hands. As he heated water for broth and coffee, he felt her watching. Him. The weight of her gaze brought back a flood of memories he'd tried so hard to forget. "You look older," she said softly. He glanced back at her, managing a wry smile. 7 years of desert sun will do that to a man. "It suits you," she said, then looked away quickly, as if the words had escaped without permission. They fell into silence as Jake prepared food and tended to her wounds. The familiarity of caring for her, of being needed by her, felt both wonderful and terrifying. For 7 years, he'd convinced himself that walking away had been the right choice, that she deserved better than a broken-down lawman with too much blood on his hands and too many enemies. But sitting here now, cleaning the cuts on her wrists where the ropes had bitten deep, he wondered if he'd been a fool. "Jake," she said suddenly, her voice hesitant. "Why did you leave?" The question he'd dreaded hung in the air between them. He'd known it would come, had been preparing for it since the moment he'd recognized her face. But now, faced with those dark eyes that had always seen too much, he found himself at a loss for words. "It's complicated," he said finally. 7 years, Jake," she said, her voice stronger now despite her injuries. 7 years I've wondered. 7 years I've asked myself what I did wrong, what I could have said differently." The pain in her voice cut through him like a blade. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said quickly. "It was never about you." "Then what?" she asked. "Help me understand." Jake set down the cloth and turned to face her fully. In the lamplight, despite the blood and bruises, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. But it wasn't just her beauty that had captured his heart all those years ago. It was her strength, her kindness, her ability to see good in a world that often seemed determined to prove there wasn't any. "Do you remember Sheriff Davies?" He asked. She nodded. Davies had been Jake's mentor. The man who'd taught him that being a lawman meant more than wearing a badge and carrying a gun. It meant standing between good people and those who would do them harm, no matter the cost. "The night before I left," Jake said, his voice growing quiet, "Davies came to see me. He'd heard rumors about us, about how I felt about you," said. "There were men in town, important men, who didn't like the idea of a white lawman taking up with an Apache woman." Yana's breath caught, but she said nothing. "He said they were planning to make an example," Jake continued. "Not just of me, but of you, of your family. They were going to claim you were spies, that you were passing information to the war parties. Davies said he couldn't protect us both. So you chose to protect me by leaving," she said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I thought if I disappeared, if I made it clear that there was nothing between us, they'd leave you alone." Jake's voice broke slightly. "I thought I was saving you." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I married Running Wolf 2 years after you left." The admission hit Jake like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to nod. "I'm glad," he lied. "I'm glad you found happiness." "Did I?" she asked, her eyes meeting his again. "Running Wolf was a good man, Jake, kind and gentle. He loved me, and I cared for him deeply. But happiness?" She shook her head. "You can't find happiness when half your heart is missing." The words hung between them, charged with 7 years of unspoken longing and regret. Jake felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, but he fought to maintain them. She was vulnerable now, grieving, in need of comfort. He couldn't take advantage of that. You should rest, he said, turning away. I'll sleep by the fire. Jake, she called softly as he reached for his bedroll. He paused but didn't turn around. Thank you, she said, for taking me in, for taking care of me. Always, he said, the word escaping before he could stop it, as he spread his bedroll by the dying fire. Jake listened to her settle into his bed. Tomorrow, he would have to decide what to do. The soldiers would be looking for her, and his cabin, isolated as it was, wouldn't stay hidden forever. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't alone. And despite everything, the danger, the complications, the pain of seeing her again, he was grateful. Chapter 3. Dangerous territory. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of horses approaching. Years of living alone had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and he was on his feet with his gun drawn before he was fully conscious. Ayanna, he whispered urgently, moving to the bed where she lay sleeping. Wake up, we have company. Eyes snapped open immediately, the survival instincts of her people evident in how quickly she became alert. How many? She asked quietly. Jake peered through a gap in the shuttered window. In the pre-dawn darkness, he could make out the shapes of at least 6 riders picking their way carefully down the hillside. They moved with military precision, and even in the dim light, he could see the glint of cavalry sabers. 6 soldiers, he reported. Maybe more. Ayanna sat up, wincing as her injuries protested the movement. They found me. Not yet, they haven't, Jake said grimly. He moved quickly to a loose floorboard near the fireplace and pried it up, revealing a hidden cache of weapons and ammunition. But they're tracking you. Question is, how? The riders were closer now, and Jake could hear the low murmur of voices. They were being cautious, which meant they weren't sure what they'd find. That was good, gave him and Ayanna a small advantage. There's a cave system about a half-mile north of here, Jake said, loading his rifle with practiced efficiency. If you can make it there, you can follow the tunnels all the way to the river. From there? No, Ayanna said firmly, struggling to her feet. I won't run again. I won't leave you to face them alone. This isn't your fight, Jake protested. Her dark eyes flashed with the fire he remembered so well. He murdered my husband. Jake, they destroyed my village. They would have sold me like cattle. This is absolutely my fight. Before Jake could argue further, a voice called out from outside. Hello, the cabin. This is Captain Morrison, U.S. Cavalry. We're looking for a dangerous Apache fugitive. Open up. Jake's blood ran cold. Morrison. He knew that name, though he'd hoped never to hear it again. Thomas Morrison, his own cousin, the man who'd made his life hell growing up. Who'd joined the army partly out of jealousy that Jake had found success as a lawman. What is it? Ayanna asked, seeing the recognition on his face. The captain, Jake said quietly. He's my cousin. Which means this isn't just about you anymore. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Thomas had always harbored resentment toward Jake, had always looked for ways to hurt him. If he'd somehow learned about Jake's past with Ayanna, if he'd been the one to capture her, ... double quotes Jake Morrison. Thomas called out again, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. I know you're in there, cousin? Yep. And I know you have something that belongs to the United States Army. Jake cursed under his breath. There was no way out of this now. Thomas knew exactly who was in the cabin and why. This had been planned from the beginning. What do you want, Thomas? Jake called back, moving to the window but keeping himself hidden. Just the Apache woman, Thomas replied. Hand her over, and we'll be on our way. No harm, no foul. And if I refuse? Thomas's laugh was cold and humorless. Then I'll be forced to arrest you for harboring a fugitive. Or worse, depending on how this plays out. Jake looked at Ayanna, who was watching him with steady, trusting eyes. In that moment, he realized that all his noble intentions 7 years ago had been for nothing. He'd tried to protect her by walking away, but fate had brought her back to him anyway. And this time, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. "Counteroffer, Thomas," Jake called out. "You and your men ride away now and I won't kill you?" The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice harder. "Now, you always were too soft, Jake. Too willing to throw your lot in with savages and outcasts. Fine. Have it your way." Jake heard the sound of rifle bolts being worked, the creak of leather as men dismounted and took position. They were going to lay siege to the cabin. "Jay," Ayanna said softly, moving to stand beside him. "I can't let you do this. These men, they'll kill you because of me." "They'll try," Jake said, checking his weapons one final time. "But I've got a few advantages they don't know about." "Such as?" Jake smiled grimly. "I know this valley like the back of my hand, and I'm not the same man I was 7 years ago." The first shot shattered the morning stillness, splintering the wood near the window.
Ow.
Jake returned fire immediately, his bullet taking one of the soldiers in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. "Stay low," he told Ayanna, then called out to his cousin. "That's one down, Thomas. How many more are you willing to lose?" "As many as it takes." Thomas shouted back, "We can't hold out forever." But Jake wasn't planning to hold out. He was planning to end this quickly and decisively. Years of solitude had taught him patience, but they'd also taught him that sometimes the only way to solve a problem was to face it head on. "There's a root cellar behind the cabin," he told Ayanna. "Wait for my signal, then make your way there. Can you handle?" "A gun?" She nodded, accepting the pistol he handed her. "Running Wolf taught me." "Good. When this is over, we're leaving this place. Together." Her eyes widened. "Jake, 7 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life when I walked away from you," he said, cupping her face gently in his hand. "I'm not making that mistake again." Before she could respond, he kissed her quickly, desperately, pouring 7 years of regret and longing into that single moment. Then he was moving, sliding out the back door of the cabin like a ghost. Jake. Morrison had spent 7 years learning how to disappear. Now it was time to remember how to fight. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Jake moved through the terrain he knew better than any man alive. Every rock, every gully, every stand of scrub oak was familiar to him. The attacking soldiers might have numbers, yet this was his ground. He circled wide, using the natural contours of the land to stay hidden while he worked his way around behind Thomas's position. The soldiers had spread out in a loose semicircle around the cabin, focused on the building and unaware that their quarry had slipped away. Jake's first target was a young private, crouched behind a boulder about 50 yards from the cabin. The soldier was so focused on watching for movement at the windows that he never heard Jake approach. Quick blow to the head with the butt of Jake's rifle, and the man dropped unconscious to the ground. 1 down, 5 to go. Jake moved like a shadow, using every skill he'd learned in his years as a lawman and refined during his time in the wilderness. The second soldier went down just as quietly, and then the third. By the time Thomas realized what was happening, half his men were out of commission. "Spread out," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "He's behind us." But the damage was done. Jake had turned the tables, and now he had the advantage. He settled into position behind a cluster of rocks that gave him a clear view of the remaining soldiers while keeping him hidden. "Thomas," he called out, "it's over. Your men are down, and you're surrounded. Surrender now, and I'll let you ride." "Out of here, never!" Thomas snarled. "I came here to finish what should have been finished years ago," Jake frowned. There was something in his cousin's voice that went beyond simple military duty or even family rivalry. This was personal in a way that ran deeper than Jake had realized. "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded. Thomas's bitter laugh echoed across the valley. "You really don't know, do you? You never knew what happened after you ran away with your tail between your legs." "I left to protect her," Jake said. "You left because you were a coward." Thomas spat, "And your precious Apache princess paid the price." Jake's blood turned to ice. "What price?" "After you disappeared, certain prominent citizens decided they still needed to make an example," Thomas said, his voice filled with malicious satisfaction. They couldn't touch you, so they settled for the next best thing. A little visit to her family's camp, a few trumped-up charges, some unfortunate resistance. The world seemed to tilt around Jake as the implications hit him. You're lying. I ask her about her brother, Jake. Ask her about her father. Ask her why she really married that Apache warrior. Was it love? Or was it because she had nothing left? From inside the cabin came a sound that tore at Jake's heart, a sob of anguish. That carried 7 years of hidden pain. Ayanna had heard every word. You son of a bitch, Jake whispered, and something cold and deadly settled over him. The truth hurts, doesn't it, cousin? Thomas taunted. Your noble sacrifice was for nothing. Worse than nothing, it made everything worse. Jake stood up slowly, his rifle trained on Thomas's position. The last of his carefully maintained emotional walls crumbled away, revealing the man he'd once been, the lawman who'd sworn to protect the innocent, no matter the cost. Thomas Morrison, he called out in a voice that carried the authority of every badge he'd ever worn. You're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and crimes against innocent people. Thomas stepped out from behind his cover, his own rifle raised. By whose authority? Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out something he hadn't looked at in 7 years, a tarnished badge that read us Marshal. He'd never officially resigned his commission, had simply disappeared one day and never returned. Technically, he was still a federal lawman. By the authority of the United States government, Jake said quietly, "Drop your weapon." I don't think. So, Thomas snarled and raised his rifle. The 2 shots rang out simultaneously, echoing across the valley like thunder. Thomas's bullet whistled past Jake's ear, so close he felt the heat of its passage. Jake's bullet found its mark. Thomas Morrison crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering on the rocks, tried to speak, blood frothing at his lips, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes found Jake's one last time, filled with a hatred that would die with him. Then he was still. Jake stood in the sudden silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. He'd killed his own cousin, blood of his blood. But as he looked toward the cabin where Ayanna waited, he felt no regret. Some sins were beyond forgiveness. He made his way back to the cabin, checking on the unconscious soldiers as he passed. They would live, though they'd have headaches for days. He gathered their weapons and horses, then pushed open the cabin door. Ayanna sat on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face. She looked up as he entered, her eyes reflecting a pain deeper than any physical wound. "It's true, isn't it?" she whispered. "What he said about my family." Jake knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Tell me." 6 months after you left, she said, her voice barely audible, soldiers came to our camp. They said my father was selling weapons to the war parties, that my brother was a scout for raiding parties. None of it was true, but they didn't care. They killed them both in front of the whole tribe. Jake closed his eyes, the weight of his choices crushing down on him. "Ayanna, I blamed myself," she continued. "I thought if I hadn't been involved with a white man, if I hadn't brought that attention to my family, ... She shook her head. "I married Running Wolf because I thought it would prove my loyalty, show everyone that I was truly Apache, but also because I thought you were never coming back. I should have stayed," Jake said, his voice raw with emotion. "I should have fought for you, for us. I should have protected you." She looked at him with eyes that held 7 years of sorrow, but also something else, something that looked like hope. "You couldn't have known what would happen. It doesn't make it right." Ayanna reached up and touched his face gently. "Jake, what's done is done. The question is, what do we do now?" Jake looked into her eyes and saw his future reflected there. A future he'd given up on long ago, but that was somehow being offered to him again. "We leave," he said, simply. "Go somewhere far away from all of this. Somewhere we can start over. Together, if you'll have me," he said. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but..." She silenced him with a kiss, soft and sweet and full of forgiveness, when they broke. Apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "Even when I hated you for leaving. Even when I married Running Wolf. Even when I thought I'd never see you again. My heart always belonged to you, and mine to you, Jake replied. Always. Chapter 5. New Horizons. 3 weeks later, Jake and Ayanna rode side by side through the golden grasslands of Colorado, the mountains rising like purple dreams in the distance. They'd left New Mexico territory behind them. Along with the pain and memories that had defined their lives for so long, the unconscious soldiers had wakened to find their captain dead and their quarry vanished. Jake had left a detailed report, with Thomas's body documenting the crimes committed against Ayanna's people and his cousin's role in covering them up. Whether the army would pursue the matter further remained to be seen. But Jake had done what he could to ensure justice was served. They'd sold the horses they didn't need and bought supplies for the journey north. Jake had also sent word to an old friend in Denver, a fellow lawman who'd retired and started a ranch. The man had written back immediately, offering Jake work and a place to start fresh. "Tell me about this friend of yours," Ayanna said as they made camp beside a clear mountain. "Stream Sam Fletcher," Jake replied, unsaddling their horses. "Good man. We worked together for years before I took the job in New Mexico. He always said if I ever needed anything. You trust him?" Jake considered the question carefully. Trust didn't come easily to him anymore, but Sam had always been different. "With our lives," he said finally, as they settled around their small campfire, sharing a simple meal of beans and hardtack. Jake found himself studying Ayanna's profile in the flickering light. The cuts and bruises from her ordeal were healing. But more than that, she seemed to be healing inside as well. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes was gradually being replaced by something he hadn't seen in 7 years' peace. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, catching him watching her. "The future," Jake admitted. "For 7 years, I didn't let myself think beyond the next day now. ... Now," he reached across the fire and took her hand. "Now I can see yours. Ahead of us, a house with a real garden, maybe some children running around the yard. Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, and all those ordinary moments I never thought I'd have." Ayanna smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Children?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "If you wanted them? I mean, we haven't really talked about—" She squeezed his hand, silencing his nervous rambling. "I want everything with you, Jake Morrison. Children, a garden, Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings, all of it." They were married 2 days later by a traveling preacher they met on the trail. It wasn't the wedding either of them had dreamed of as young people. No family, no celebration. Just the two of them, the preacher and his wife as witness, standing beside a mountain lake with the sun setting behind the peaks. But as Jake slipped a simple gold band onto Ayanna's finger ring he'd bought from a trader they'd encountered and listened to her speak her vows in a voice clear and strong, he knew it was perfect. They'd lost so much, had so many years stolen from them, but they'd found their way back to each other. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said with a smile. Jake cupped Ayanna's face in his hands and kissed her with all the love and hope he'd carried in his heart for 7 long years. When they broke apart, both were crying. "Mrs. Morrison," Jake said softly. "I could get used to that," she replied, laughing through her tears. Epilogue. 5 years later. Sound of children's laughter drifted across the pasture as Jake rode up to the house he and Ayanna had built together. It was a simple structure, but solid and warm, with a wraparound porch and a garden that was Ayanna's pride and joy. Their twin sons. Now 4 years old, came running to meet him, their dark hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. Little Jake had his father's green eyes, while Tommy had inherited his mother's warm brown ones. Both boys were fearless, adventurous, and absolutely devoted to their parents. "Papa," little Jake called out. "Mama said you were bringing supplies from town. Did she now?" Jake said, dismounting and scooping both boys up in his arms. "Well, I might have something special for 2 good boys." He pulled wrapped penny candy from his saddlebags, grinning as the boys' eyes lit up. "But first, where's your mama?" "In the kitchen," Tommy said around a mouthful of candy. "She's making bread." Jake found Ayanna standing at the kitchen counter. her hands covered in flour, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with the smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "How is town?" she asked, accepting his kiss despite the flour on her hands. "Interesting," Jake said, pulling a letter from his pocket. "This came for you." Iana wiped her hands on her apron and took the letter, her brow furrowing as she recognized the handwriting. "It's from Maria Gonzalez in Santa Fe." Maria was a woman they'd met during their journey north, a teacher who worked with Apache children. She and Iana had become friends, corresponding regularly over the years. Iana opened the letter and read silently, her expression growing more serious with each line. When she finished, she looked up at Jake with tears in her eyes. "It?" he asked, concerned. "She says there's been developments in the case against the soldiers who destroyed my village," Iana said. "The army's finally taking action. They want me to testify." Jake felt his stomach clench. They'd built a good life here, a peaceful life. The thought of returning to New Mexico, of dredging up all those painful memories. You don't have to go," he said. "We have a good life here. The boys are happy. We're happy." Iana set the letter down and took his hands. "Jake, they're offering justice for my people, for my father and brother. How can I not go?" He looked into her eyes and saw the same strength that had first attracted him to her all those years ago. She was right, of course. She'd carried the weight of her family's deaths for too long. If there was a chance for justice, for closure, she had to take it. "Then we'll go," he said. "The boys come with us," Jake said. Firmly, "I'm never leaving you again, Iana. Whatever comes, we face it as a family." She smiled through her tears and kissed him softly. "Have I told you lately that I love you, Jake Morrison?" "Not in the last hour," he replied, pulling her close. "But I never get tired of hearing it." They held each other in their kitchen,